They are computer programs which run autonomously on their own, and they typically would play with a live instrumentalist and just respond to what they're doing and basically improvise along with them. I guess it's modelling the creative process in a way and seeing if you can. But what's the difference about live algorithms compared to, say, doing an offline analysis and saying, here's some rules for how Mozart wrote some notes or whatever? You can do that, and that's interesting, and we're using some of those ideas, but it's the idea that the thing runs live and has a certain unpredictability and is responsive. So I guess that's what makes this particular way of doing things with machines quite interesting for me as well, is that live, unpredictable, responsive factor, and the fact that it does seem that you can model some of that human kind of the human improvisational behaviours. You can capture some of those and engage the humans with those processes as you've modelled them.
I guess because I'm the only person in the relationship between me and the wonderful computers that likes something or doesn't like something. So if I don't know, there was a period of time earlier where it felt like I was just beatboxing constantly and the computer was just making noise, and it was just a bit like I was like doing my thing and the computer was just sort of like behind me making noise, and we sort of decided to change that so that it was more interactive. But if I kind of don't really have much interactive interest in what sounds the computer's making, I'll just sort of like do my thing over top of it, and then if it does something that I'm like, oh hi, I'll be like, you're right there. I won't be. I'll beatbox back at it, something.
It's going to sound weird, but actually there's a point where it becomes kind of alive. And I can listen if I don't hear that thing where it's got a sort of life to it, as artificial life, not at all like, but I don't know what else to call it. Then okay, at least you've got somewhere, and maybe it needs to be tweaked or fixed a little bit, but you've got something you can work with. Whereas until you get to that point where it comes alive, it isn't. You have to get it there first before anything else happens. So once you've got then some material, some algorithms that in this context, and the thing is, you put a different input into it, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't be alive necessarily.
Now it's really taking the clue.
Okay.
So why would I not just improvise myself, right? And with basically set all the parameters I've set up, which change automatically. Why not just control those myself? And I have performed like that, and that's another approach. But I suppose it's one thing is the novelty. Not just the fact that novelty in the sense of a gimmick, but novelty in the sense of it generates new things. And you've probably heard some. I know Finn's is quite into this idea, and I know Paul was just mentioning it just then. But the idea that it takes you to melodic places you wouldn't have been in otherwise if a human was even if a human was controlling the sounds the machine's making. Just because it has that. It has its own kind of life to it almost. It takes you to new places.
It's interesting when you're playing with or against an algorithm. You can get into all these interesting situations like sort of feedback loops where you're playing into something and then it's playing you something back, and you're based on what you've played it or based on how it's been trained on your musical language or whatever, and then it will lead you into places, especially as an improviser, unusual sort of harmonic and melodic territory that you would not normally think of, and it leads you in directions.
do you kind of, I suppose a bit of an odd question, do you personalise it in some sense, or are you all constantly aware that it is just an algorithm? Or?
No, I just take it as, I think, because I find music's quite an abstract sort of art form anyway, so I just go get into, like, you know, into the music and don't really think, okay, this is like an album. Try and just close my eyes, or, you know, not worry too much that it's not another human being. But you don't get that synchronicity that you get with playing with other improvisers, especially if you've worked a lot with them. I think that's the other thing that I was saying before. It's like the amount of time that I've been playing with a drummer now for nearly 20 years, and when we play together and improvise together, it's real kind of tight-knit. I know what, to a certain extent, what he might play, you know, and like the same for him. So because we haven't had that much time working with this sort of stuff, that's not happening. I imagine if you interviewed me in 20 years, you know, it might be a different story.
Well, one thing I think is really interesting is if you look at something like puppetry, and puppetry goes back thousands of years, and it's this kind of suspension of disbelief in something. And I kind of see AI as an incredibly sophisticated, or in that sense, as a very sophisticated form of puppetry. So you create something, and then you suspend your disbelief, and that's you can then have some relationship with that, and that isn't unusual. People have relationships with completely inanimate objects with very little. They don't need very much to get quite a meaningful relationship with something. So I think that it's interesting because it's building on top of that kind of approach. But I think the idea of whether you can make something, it all gets into very, very murky depths when you start saying, does it have a soul? Can it really, like, are these questions actually answerable? It's
there was also a kind of something I found quite funny in it, that it was it felt like there was some arsehole improvisers together with this poor flautist. You know, some of those algorithms really had like egos, basically, and I really like the kind of tasteless ECM reverb algorithm that just whacked on swimming pool reverb at inopportune moments. So it felt more like a kind of a battle kind of scenario.
I mean, there is something fundamentally different between computers and acoustic instruments, I think, but it's also electronic music in general, and recordings and synthesis, and I think that has been a problem from the beginning, in a way. I think people are obviously getting more familiar with it, but it's always going to be some sort of issue, right? And I think it's not like an issue that has a particular solution. I don't think it does. But again, like the problem is very interesting. So in a way, just finding clever ways of dealing with that tension, let's say, is kind of interesting as well. I mean, of course, I mean, as technology advances, is like we're just gonna get more familiar with it, and so on and so on. But I think, you know, our acoustic environment is just there all the time. So I mean, we're just fundamentally kind of bound to that, and I don't think that's something that we can escape. But I do agree that in the future it's going to be a mixed kind of reality between acoustic and non-acoustic sort of sounds.
I think we're in a good position now. In no way we've explored the possibilities that are available right now. I mean, there's loads of space left, I think.
In terms of the limitations, I think actually the problem arises when there aren't enough limitations. So when you're given a piece of software and somebody says this will do everything, or the ideal system which you just imagine and it will happen, nothing would happen. It would be really, really dull. Like, all the interesting things happen when you've got some really stupid restriction, like, I don't know, I guess, like with the stuff that I do, you've got to fit it into some device and do something interesting with it, and then there's a friction there, and you can kind of think, well, what can I do with this restriction? And I think that most creativity comes from that kind of thing, rather than, painters don't think, oh, if only I could just imagine a picture into existence, because their relationship is that with a brush and the paint and the canvas, and it was all this kind of body kind of thing. But having said that, I think we're right at the beginnings of computers as they are.
Well, here's a good anecdote about it. There's a guy, Matthew Yee-King, was telling me about, and he wrote this Markov chain which basically fed, I forget his name, I'll ask and get it for you later on, but he fed all of Bach's chorales, or possibly like his, I don't know whether we'd have put the complete works of J.S. Bach into a computer program that analysed all the kind of musical choices that Bach would have made and wrote chorales in the style of Bach. But because computers don't have any understanding of God, they're going to miss out on that whole thing, which really, for me, makes Bach's music transcend normal, everyday kind of existence. Well, there's something special about that. You can't quite put a finger on it, but for me, that's that spiritual aspect, and I find that I don't get that with the Supercollider program.
Yeah.
Maybe they just haven't built the battery yet.